Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for talking with us today, this afternoon, about the zoo bond on the May ballot this year. I'm wondering actually if Councilor Lewis, if you wouldn't mind starting us off by telling us what this is about.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Christine Lewis, and I serve on Metro Council. I represent District 2, the southern portion of the region, and the communities of deep Southwest Portland through Lake Oswego and West Lynn, Oregon City, Milwaukee, Happy Valley, Clackamas. And as a representative of those communities, I work with my fellow councilors to do the things that Metro has been tasked with doing for the longest time, which is working on land use, working on solid waste, garbage, and recycling, taking care of the animals at our zoo, and then also working on parks and nature, on land use, transportation planning, and most recently, we've started to do work on housing. So as stewards of the zoo, Metro is advancing this ballot measure on this May's ballot. We are asking for community support to step up so that we can execute projects in the 20-year campus master plan. We have developed that master plan over the past year and a half. Over 1,000 individuals participated in community outreach, charrettes, and the planning process. And we're really proud of that work in order to identify the top concerns for outdated habitat, for infrastructure at the zoo that is at the end of its life or failing, and that will address some poor visitor flow. The zoo is a community treasure. We value it as a place to learn about conservation. It's where real work and science is being done to save species from extinction and take care of animals. It's also a great place for families to learn, to get educated about the natural environment. And it is also a driver for our regional tourism economy. So we're asking for individuals to step up, support the zoo like they did in 2008. And we are proud of the work that we did delivering on the 2008 measure, and we are prepared to deliver projects again in the framework of transparency. And that's the work I'm here to talk about today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering if you can start off by telling us just a little bit more detail on what projects will this bond deliver if voters pass it.
Sure. And I can start by saying that the priorities have been set in the master plan and that they're values driven. We know a couple of the exhibits that are at the end of their natural life, and that the standards that we hold ourselves to, including the American Zoological Aquarium's AZA standards, have really identified our pretty urgent needs. Penguinarium, the work around the water tanks in Pacific Shores and the sea otters habitat, as well as indoor giraffe facilities. So those are top of mind. But if it's okay, I'd hand it off to Heidi to talk about some of the other tiers of priority projects.
Okay, and before we start that, when you say priority projects, I guess what I want to understand is, will this bond build a new penguinarium? Will this bond build, or are those just possible projects?
If passed, we know for sure that those projects that I've just listed are ones that will get done. Some of the other goals of the master plan are more interchangeable or probably up for further refinement, but the animal habitats that I've listed are ones that we know for sure need to be top of our list. And frankly, in 2008, we passed a measure supporting the zoo with the bond, and we didn't do the campus plan that helped guide that bond until 2011. And we've learned from that. We're, I think, smarter and better now in that we've done the master plan, and now we're picking our projects off of that comprehensive list and that comprehensive 20-year vision.
Yeah, and I'm Heidi Rahn, Oregon Zoo Director, and I'm here just to provide a few facts, and I can confirm that we have this campus plan that's identified the layout of the future of the zoo, building off of the last round of upgrades. And that campus plan gives us the prioritized list of what to pick from. And we're in the process, we have identified what those priorities will be based primarily on animal needs, accessibility, sustainable use of our resources, and conservation education. And some of the first priorities are really going to be addressing potential infrastructure failure. And I would say that is highest potential in our kind of seal, sea otter, and penguinarium areas because they are pretty outdated. The penguinarium's from 1959, so about 65 years old. And then the piping in the sea otter and the seal exhibit is also at risk of failure. So we're starting with our priorities of the highest needs, and then we're moving through the campus. And we've got a sequence laid out of how we would go through the campus based on the highest needs, the business impact, and the guest flow, as well as cost estimates based on square footage, and then escalation based on the timing of when we would be doing construction. So we envision about a 12 to 14 year timeframe to get through a significant portion of those upgrades. And as Councilor Lewis mentioned, that would include coastal shores, which is penguins, sea otters, seals, and the kelp forest. It would include the front entry to provide more accessible flow, and also better visitor comforts for our visitors. And then we would be moving into the whole Africa zone, predators, savanna, and that kind of whole south part of the zoo that needs an update. And all of that was informed by several things. Number one, we started by listening to our community, to our staff, to our visitors, and what they needed. We did an assessment of the risks and the failures, and then we engaged folks in a year-long process to identify what the campus could look like for the future.
So is it written? Oh,
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add quickly, so my name is Susan Hartnett. I was the chair of the 2008 Zoo Bond Citizen Oversight Committee. And in our final report to the Metro Council, we very specifically recommended that the zoo do an update on its comprehensive campus plan, and that be the leading item for future funding. The committee felt that while the projects identified in 2008 were appropriate and highest priority, because there was no plan at the beginning, as we got farther into the projects, it sometimes got hard to be responsive or strategic as things changed, like construction costs. And then, of course, the pandemic added a little final thing there. But the committee felt very strongly that an update of the comprehensive plan should be the first thing. And I personally think that what the zoo has done to create this plan is absolutely spot on, and that they're using it to guide the decision-making for the next bond is exactly what the Oversight Committee expected and recommended.
So is it laid out which areas will definitely be addressed in the bond, and which areas are possible depending on funding of any number of issues?
I can say that we have an updated campus plan, and that is includes the priority projects that would be done if we received the bond funding. And then there's an additional list of projects that would come if there was additional funding or at a later phase. So yes, we have a draft list. I would say it's not final because we need to bring it back to the Metro Council for approval this summer.
Okay, so voters can't be sure of what exactly they're going to be getting, except for the penguinarium, the infrastructure, water infrastructure you talked about. I guess that's what I'd like to know. Like, what are you guaranteeing voters that they're going to see as a result of the bond? Like, I have what I think is the campus plan, and it lists plaza enhancements, coastal shores, Africa Phase 1, South Hub, and Africa Phase 2. Are those all firm commitments with this bond?
Yes, those are the backbone of the bond. And I would say there are some things in the bond language that refer to our values of doing things around sustainability and resiliency. And we've pointed out the problem of those animals live there through heat waves, through snowstorms. And we know that it's going to take time and money to actually develop the resiliency plan. So we can't say exactly, where we're going to have a backup generator or where we're going to do electrification, but we know that those are the projects that will be funded for resiliency and climate. And then additionally, we know that there's some accessibility concerns. I have 2 kiddos, and at the end of the day, going up, I think like 80 feet in grade is really hard with a stroller. Imagine doing that in a wheelchair or other mobility. So what are we going to do in order to get not just the wayfinding aspect, but actually paths that are more accessible universally. So those are problem statements that we have begun some design, but we haven't made those choices yet. And honestly, I think it's important to recognize that we've identified a proper scope of what we want to do, but we haven't spent like refinement dollars or individual planning dollars until we know we've secured the investment to actually do the work. We don't want to do the refinement and then find out we don't have the money and have spent those public resources getting really sharp pencils to no use value.
Okay. How did you develop the 8.5 cents per thousand in assessed value tax rate? Was this kind of driven by this is what we've been getting, so it won't be increasing the rate? Or was this driven by these are the projects we know we need to fund, and what is that amount roughly total?
Sure. I will say that the council made it very clear that our expectation was that we were staying at the existing rate or dropping below, and 8.5 cents did drop below, and that was the preference of council. There's probably no rate that would be enough to do literally everything that we could do on site, and we have to be smart and mix these bond investments with other priorities that can be funded both through philanthropy and other sources. So that's where it came down to a prioritization exercise that Heidi helped lead, so that plan was matched up with what can 380 million roughly buy, and it did cover the things that we had prioritized.
Also, in terms of and what it looks like is that if you add up these the first one to the 5 that we talked about, that's about 350. And so is the remainder for contingency? Is it administration? What would that cover?
I can address that. And we're building that out, but yes, it would be for that administration, but also some of the projects in the campus plan didn't make the priority list, but we know we have to take care of those assets in order to extend their life. They won't have a huge overhaul because we can't do it all. And we mentioned that we had to prioritize. So there will be smaller projects to extend the life of those areas so that we're taking care of those assets. So there's some smaller capital projects that would be included in that without a major overhaul of that area. And I can give you an example of like the Great Northwest. It's a total feature of the zoo. People love that feature. But there's areas where we have to upgrade our water systems. We have to add some mesh. We know we have projects there. So that would probably be in that that remaining funding, and then contingency for sure. If that is definitely something we learned from the last bond measure, is to make sure that we have a good contingency for things that change. Cost escalation has already been incorporated in, but those things are, we can't totally predict that. So quite a bit of contingency. And I should add, prior to being the zoo director starting in 2021, I oversaw the last round of zoo bond investments since 2013. So applying a lot of those lessons learned to how we build out this next phase of investments.
Okay. Susan, let me ask you in terms of just oversight the 2008 bond. There remains controversy over kind of how the zoo handled elephants and whether and just there not being a sanctuary for them. What was the committee's view of that?
So the committee did look at that quite closely. We had several reports. I wasn't there in 2008 when that bond was put together, so I can't speak from personal knowledge. What I do know is from our work as an oversight committee, we found that there was no commitment to actually build a remote elephant center. There was a commitment to look at it and study it, assess it. And we know also that over a long period of time, 5, 6, 7 years, the zoo and Metro looked at it in several different efforts. Part of that was trying to identify a place to do it. And then in coming to realization that remote elephant center was looking less likely to occur, there was the Metro Council appointed a task force that gathered all the information, looked at it very closely, looked at the operational impacts, the impacts on the elephants to go back and forth. the operational costs associated with it, the capital expenses associated with it. And the task force concluded and recommended to the Metro Council that the remote elephant center not continue to be pursued, that it was not a smart move at that point. I don't think that there was a, don't ever do it, but stop doing it now. And unless something significant changes in all of those elements, which in my personal opinion seems very unlikely, it's a costly thing to do. And I think one of the things that really hit me in hearing that report would be the impact on the elephants. And since then, one of the things that's occurred to me is, we had a fire out not too far from our condor hatching facility, and there was concerns. I can't remember now if the condors were actually evacuated. They were, okay. I thought about it in the context of what would happen if that were where the elephant sanctuary was. Moving elephants is not an easy thing to do. And when I think about global climate change in our region, wildfires are of concern. So, it just really reinforced for me that it was the right decision that the zoo made. And I understand that there were people who feel like it was a bait and switch. But in looking at the actual materials that were presented to voters, I don't believe that there was a promise made or a promise broken. And that's why the committee's final report said the 2008 bond delivered on voter expectations. We could not have said that with a straight face if we thought there was bait and switch on the remote elephant center.
And I guess that's part of my concern and why I'm sort of like asking for the list of projects and where it's committed, because the bond language itself is pretty squishy. It says including but not limited to. There's a lot of things where it's like, if it sounds like a lawyer, and probably a lawyer did write it, that this is a way that you can argue that you fulfill the intent of the bond measure, even if it's not part of what was used to pass it. Because certainly while the bond measure from 2008 does not commit to a sanctuary, that was the common understanding. The Oregon Humane Society executive director talked about that, several years after the passage. Many others, there's been news stories about it. There's, that was certainly part of the rhetoric in terms of getting people on board.
Yeah.
And so I guess that is why I am looking for real specifics about what the zoo is committing to deliver.
And I understand that. I will say that one of the other elements in assessing the value of pursuing a remote elephant center was understanding the true success of elephant lands in its design and in how it actually activates the elephants to walk and to be able to mingle with each other when they want to, but to be able to go be separate if they want to. That the elephant lands habitat was designed with so much of that in mind and was so successful. One of the things that the Oversight Committee heard was a report from a PhD student, Sharon Glasson, is that right, Heidi Glasson? Glazer, sorry. Who got her PhD studying the elephants at the Oregon Zoo, first before the construction, during the construction, and after the construction. And she had tremendous information, very positive information about the changes, positive changes in their behaviors and in their lives post the development of elephant lands. And it didn't seem like a remote elephant center was going to add more to that. But I understand the concern about, we want a list that we can check off and say yes. I will remind you, one of the things I said at the beginning was the list was so rigid with the first bond that it left little room to do those strategic things. Heidi mentioned, where do we put an emergency generator? I remember that because there was significant construction cost savings in the early years of the bond due to the Great Recession, there was a little extra money, and they would come to the oversight committee and say, hey, we'd like to put in an extra generator over here, or connect this system to that system because it gives us better redundancy in our infrastructure. I think the way the zoo is approaching this current bond through a campus plan gives them more ability to be strategic when things like that come up. And overall, I firmly believe that the voters will get what's being promised and a whole lot more, just because I know that from the last bond. The zoo is very, very professional and strategic about how they approach the small things that add up to big things.
Great, thank you. Is there a cap on administrative costs?
Do not believe there is. And there was not one in 2008 either. But that was something that Susan's committee did monitor. And in particular, the opportunity to do good planning up front so you phase things appropriately and so that you leave the zoo at least partially operational is really critical, because if you do your phasing wrong, then you all of a sudden have a much larger budget problem of people not being able to still visit the zoo while construction's happening. So project management is a really critical piece of the measure.
Okay. And is there a, I'd also like to talk about just in terms of how the zoo is doing financially. I think you guys are expecting 1.3 million visitors this year, which still, it's not at your pre-COVID levels. How much, and Metro also had to contribute, is it 17 million from its general fund over to the zoo?
Yeah, so property tax has for a long time been an enduring part of the zoo's budget. About 30% of operating budget comes from Metro every year. And that leaves about 60% from all events and ticket sales, and about 10% from philanthropy handled through our partnership with the Oregon Zoo Foundation. And that's operating costs. That's year over year. So even if you raise ticket prices, even if you did more events, you're not really raising the amount that's needed to do major capital investment. In terms of the ongoing support, I think you're right with the 27, and I think the opportunity to look at the investment that we've made for operating does take into account our need to protect animals, do the conservation work, but also emphasize the facility as a regional asset. 1.3 million visitors. It's the most attractive ticketed venue in the state, most visited, I should say. And we have shifted how we do our ticketing. We now do time tickets, so we don't have those rushes. It's better for the visitor experience. It was initially because of COVID capacity limits, but it does mean that we on some days are not hitting our max because people don't naturally capacitate across the spectrum of entry times. Additionally, we've backed away from the big major concerts, and that's like tens of thousands of individuals who used to come and they were on site at the zoo, but I wouldn't say they saw the animals. I wouldn't say they learned anything about conservation. And we are now focused on local acts, and summer nights at the zoo is now really focused on getting folks there with music, with food carts, but still having an animal forward, conservation focused experience. So we're focusing there on delivering mission aligned activity and not just getting more people in.
And so has the general fund contribution been increasing, decreasing? Has it remained the same?
It's remained roughly the same. Heidi, you just showed me that number this morning. If you could help understand the growth over time, please.
Yeah, and it's growing. It's growing a little bit this next year, and that was only because we're gonna get into some Metro budgeting here, but only because we're holding some back in the general fund as like reserve for the zoo. But the zoo is built up. We built up our own reserve that keeps us strong and healthy, so we don't need the general fund to hold that anymore. One of the things that we've learned coming out of COVID and we had to lay off about 30% of our employees, was we don't ever want to be in that position again. It was a really, it was a difficult place for a lot of us all to be. So making sure that we built up a healthier reserve. And so we updated our financial reserve policy and our capital reserve policy to make sure we're putting aside the money we need to hold it. If there's a short-term crisis, we're going to be okay. If there's, we need an ongoing capital investment, we got that, but not at the amount we need for this significant overhaul. So back to the question. It has increased a little bit, basically just reallocating it from the general fund. So now it's, I think, close to 20 million versus 17 million, if I'm getting my numbers right.
Is it anticipated that the zoo would never be a self-sustaining operation, that it's always going to have to get money from the general fund?
That is our understanding as a council, that it is part of our core funding priorities when it comes to the property tax for our base metro property tax.
Okay. Is there any, one of the things, and I might be wrong about this, but the 2008 bond, I thought, called for some improvements in the hippo exhibit. And then, but in 2018, it seems that the hippos were sent elsewhere. Is that correct? And also, are you anticipating any animals that would be that the zoo would lose as a result of some of these changes, these capital improvements?
I can address that. Yeah, that is correct. Hippos were identified, but then we did the master planning for the campus after the ballot measure passed and realized that hippos require, we knew, but they require a lot of water, and we couldn't meet our water conservation goals and manage a huge hippo pool, and they weren't a priority conservation species for us. So then we decided to double down and expand rhinos into the hippo habitat and really just double down on rhinos and be able to support that endangered species, which we ended up doing. But that's exactly why we did the planning up front this time, so that we do have better knowledge, and we have looked at the water usage, and we have looked at the campus, so we know what species we're building for. The reality is, things could change in 10 years in terms of the species we are needed to care for. So one of the things that we do is help work with our local government agencies and tribal partners on species recovery. And what I mean by that is endangered species that they ask the Oregon Zoo to use our husbandry and animal caretaking skills to help breed these species for release back into the wild. So we do that currently with about 4 different Pacific Northwest species. We're trying to get ahead of it and figure out what are they going to need from us in the next decade, but that keeps changing based on the risks to different species. So we're trying to design for some flexibility in there to focus on areas of the zoo, but the specific species might change. So I can't say yet what will be there in 10 years, but we do have a whole species planning process where we go through thinking through, is this, our climate, our staff capacity, and our staff knowledge and skill sets, what is needed locally, what do our guests want, and what is a population management priority within all zoos and aquariums. So we have a very thorough planning process. Yes, that is the scenario with the hippos, and then we expanded for rhinos. And now, as you know, we have a rhino baby, which is great. And planning for their new habitat would be part of this upgrade. One of the things to just understand too, as we think about this, is a lot of the design elements will be focused on the changing climate we have in our region and making sure that we have better indoor and outdoor spaces, both for our visitors and the animals. And I think of that when I think of baby Chamu, our rhino, because sometimes he can't be out because there are specific standards for temperature in terms of when we can have them outside. I think it's 40 degrees. And so on colder days, people might not see baby Tamu. So how do we make sure that we are designing spaces that are both good for the animals and the visitors to address those extremes?
Yeah, just one quick thing to that, since we're talking about hippos and rhinos. I am also a trustee on the Board of Trustees for the Oregon Zoo Foundation. And I know not only from my involvement with the Oversight Committee, but now as a member of the foundation, The foundation is very instrumental in helping sometimes with the need for additional funding and the need for flexibility in funding. Because there was that switch from Hippo to Rhino, there was concern about how bond funds were being used and what was promised. And if I'm remembering correctly, Heidi, you can correct me. If I'm not, I believe that the funds that were used to do the rhino habitat were 100% from the Oregon Zoo Foundation, and the bond funds were used on bond projects.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So it's a very important and robust partnership between the foundation and the zoo, which I came to learn about on the Oversight Committee and said, I want to stay involved. So now I'm on the foundation board.
So when I was looking at the bond measure, there was talk about redoing the penguinarium, et cetera, and moving like the red panda exhibit, et cetera, and stuff like that. It doesn't mention the red panda again. You're not looking to send red pandas out, are you?
I believe there's a potential space where we're holding for Asia species that it could be red panda, could be tiger, could be a variety of things. So we just haven't defined it. It's over kind of in our new really redefined Asia area near Elephant Lands. So at this point, where I'm not certain what species will go in there. Could be red panda. We love the red panda. We know our community loves the red panda. And we will try to, make sure we're accommodating where we can.
But that would not be one of the conservation priority species. I can't remember exactly what you called it.
It's not one of our species recovery efforts in terms of like what we're breeding and helping with the government partners from a release perspective. It's more of, an ambassador species here.
Okay.
It might also be a good moment to bring up their species survival plans, which are documents that are held by the entire network of AZA institutions. And we play our role in order to keep genetics as diversified as possible. So as much as we have desires, sometimes the AZA for breeding purposes has more direct need. So we sometimes have to lean in and say, this is our priority and we can give here. So the species survival plan for some of these animals is kind of the blueprint for how we make our investments. Heidi, did I get that right?
Yes. Nice job.
Are you concerned that there's a changing ethic at all regarding zoos' existence period? Certainly, Susan, you talked about how, the difference in elephants' quality of life from before and after the addition of Elephant Lands, but there are many people who feel that it's inhumane, period, to have them in a confined enclosure. Are you concerned that some of that lagging interest compared to pre-pandemic days is actually a population that no longer supports the idea of zoos?
I would have absolutely no basis to answer that question. But I don't think that's, I think zoos have as much relevancy in different ways as they ever did. The conservation activities that go on at zoos are so critical. And the Oregon Zoo is a great example of it for species survival at this point. And the education component of that is truly remarkable. People understand how decisions they make about the food that they buy, whether it has sustainably produced palm oil in it or just palm oil, and the impact that palm oil farming has on the Asian elephants. That's amazingly important information as we continue to see the signs of human impact on our globe. So the role that zoos play in assuring that species that are endangered, threatened, on the brink, the black rhino is a great example of that. And to have a baby black rhino at our zoo is pretty special. I also think as I'm not sure if it was Christine or Heidi mentioned it earlier, it is an important place for people to come together and share important and unique experiences. most of us don't get to go to Africa on safari, and our contact with wild animals will be limited to a zoo. It's also an opportunity to just be in a more natural setting and encounter animals, whether they're exotic animals or, you know, just plain old Northwest animals. You know, most of us live in cities and we don't get out to those settings as much. So I think zoos play a really important role in that. You know, it's hard to say whether or not there's, you know, basis of, yes, people don't want zoos, so they've stopped coming to the Oregon Zoo, or is it really, we're doing timed entry, we've stopped doing concerts, that's why our numbers appear to be down. I certainly know when I talk with people, especially people who have children, people who are grandparents are a great one. Zoos are very much a part of their lives and important in their family life.
I did, when you mentioned the red panda was a fan favorite, it made me think of the train. What is the latest on the train? It's not really related to the bond, but where are we with the train? Speaking of bringing people back to the zoo.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I want to underscore your phrasing. It's not really related to the bond. So it has been something that has not surfaced. I have asked my colleagues to put forward a budget note asking staff to do a task force to help us understand the literal lay of the land. This is not something that Metro or Oregon Zoo can tackle on our own. We need to involve City of Portland Parks. I consider it more a question around placemaking. Obviously, it is a beloved part of the zoo experience, but it is also about experience in Washington Park. So my hope is that we will have a task force to first talk about the processes that have happened, including the Washington Park plan that's been adopted at City of Portland Parks. Also talk about what seismic and aging issues are there and some real numbers on the budget, because everybody you know, can play an engineer on TV, but let's ask a real one what it's going to cost. And at the end of the day, I want it to be a separate process and not conflated with this bond. But I do believe that in this next year, we'll have a task force to start really truthing out what potential futures would look like.
And second question, I'm just curious, how did the Penguinarium go for so long with not being at the top of the list?
Well, I can say that in the last round of investments, we did invest in water there and upgrading our water systems. We used to dump and refill that pool twice a week, and now we do it about twice a year. So we have invested in it to extend the life of the asset, but we had other priorities: polar bears, primates, elephants, building a new education center, because our focus is really on that education and connecting people, and then bringing condors from our offsite exhibit on site so people knew what we were doing for condors. It is the #1 conservation focus that people think of when they think of the Oregon Zoo. And now because we were able to connect them to that on site. So we had other priorities, but we did extend the life of that asset in that last round.
What happens if this doesn't pass?
Sure. I certainly don't want to spend too much time thinking about that, because that would be a sad day. It's a community treasure our community loves. But if this measure doesn't pass, we won't have the resources to take on large scale investments in the second half of our zoo that wasn't upgraded in 2008. There are certain parts of the exhibits that we'll absolutely have to reprioritize and find ways to do those upkeep. And the other projects will probably take far longer than the 15 or 20-year plan has designed them to be implemented in. The opportunity to ask philanthropy to help is something that I've been asked time and time again on this campaign. Philanthropy could step up for one project, but we do not have philanthropy at the scale to tackle half a campus in this community.
And I was just going to back that up from the Zoo Foundation board perspective. We've talked about this. We know what our capacity is. We've built our capacity significantly in the last 10 years, but we do not have the capacity. And honestly, I'm not sure that there's a nonprofit foundation in the state of Oregon that has the capacity to raise $380 million. We will do the best we can to continue to partner, but part of the reason why the Oregon Zoo Foundation board has helped finance the Political Action Committee and campaign is because we know this is must-have money for the zoo. It will change the face of the zoo for generations to come. It will set the stage for the ongoing improvements at the zoo and make it a better zoo for animals and you, which I just love as a little catchphrase.
And I guess, can I add one more thing? I've visited several other zoos, well-renowned, well-respected, very good zoos. And they look and feel different as a visitor because you can't walk more than 5 steps without stepping on some stone that's named after somebody, or look at an animal exhibit that is sponsored by Phil and corporate brand here. And our zoo has been built and remodeled already by the will of the community, and I don't want to move away from that. I don't want to spend our time working on naming opportunities and private rights of, who gets to decide what animal gets featured. I really want to focus on the fact that we're driven by the science of the animals, that we have a master plan that has incorporated community input and the science. And if community invests, that's what we're going to continue to see, is that science-led, community-oriented value showing up at the zoo.
And Councilor Lewis, was there any discussion about asking the zoo to come back with a much smaller ask? It seems that government agencies, once they get a levy or a bond measure passed, kind of view that tax rate as locked in. And it seems that that is what drives the next bond, as opposed to saying, okay, what is it that we actually really need, and how do we take into account the massive unaffordability crisis that we have, and the huge number of needs. Metro's choosing not to go forward with a housing bond, another affordable housing bond, because of that concern. So why was there any discussion about pushing back on the zoo and saying, it seems that the first 3 things on your list are things that must be done in the next 10 years. Let's focus on that, regroup, let's figure out, how to structure something that's going to be less burdensome for taxpayers.
Council didn't ask for a scaled back version because we did see the zoo come back responsive to our desire for that slight decrease in the rates people are already paying. And we know the needs are so great. You bring up the potential future for housing at Metro. That's a different scenario because that's talking about adding additional tax, whereas right now we are talking about current rates and a slight decrease. The opportunity to do things well, and particularly to not do half measures, felt particularly right coming out of the pandemic and needing to really make sure that we were taking care of our regional tourism economy. We need to make sure that we don't take the foot off the gas on the stuff that is our core mission, and that includes the zoo.
Do you anticipate that Metro would be, in terms of the next Parks and Levy bond measure or levy, Parks and Open Space, I can't remember exactly how I worded that, but that there will be, Metro is going to more seriously kind of direct staff to look at significantly lowering the tax rate as opposed to just locking in what it has?
I think our council has had a number of conversations around particularly the levy, that we at Metro play a really significant role in operating what we call big nature close to home. And that comes with some significant cost drivers. And it also comes with some opportunity to do work in community with partners who are representative of community. So in that respect, we're going to be very open to what the community wants us to do. And there is that balance between current or maintained tax rate and providing some relief, which frankly helps, as you're pointing out, stabilize folks in the communities.
Great, thank you. Sorry, let me mute my phone. Great. I think I'm pretty much all set on my questions. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask? No?
I just wanted to, when you were talking about the red panda, just to clarify, you're not talking about the red panda that you currently have leaving at all. You're just saying after he dies, there's not a clear plan because he is, is ill, right? And old. And there's not a clear plan to replace him with another red panda yet.
Well, that depends on how long he's with us. If he's with us up until the start of construction, then we will need to find a different place for him. If he isn't, then we do actually have a few other, at least one or if not two other red pandas that are looking for homes, and depending on timing, they could join us. So a lot of those things are just up in the air on timing.
But it sounds like you're not committing that there will be a red panda at the zoo, you know, 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Correct. I think there's a lot of things that could change, and a lot of things that, you know, if we're under construction, and then designing different areas, and then depending on what is going on with the species survival plan. Those are unknowns at this time.
Okay.
But also
I would
Moose
just-
is not
can I
going
just
there.
add-
He's just gonna die. That right? Like he's not gonna be like taken away necessarily. Or is that a possibility?
I highly doubt that's a
Okay.
possibility.
Not that
I just wanted to add that the stuff that Heidi was talking about is happening at all kinds of other zoos, and the complexities that the zoos deal with through AZA on what animals need to be where for how long, and where are they going after that, and who should they breed with, and who do they get along with, and can they be housed with this animal or that animal. It is so amazingly complex, and on the oversight committee, we got just the tiniest taste of that. I think there must be like this giant spreadsheet that someone manages of all that stuff, and I can't imagine it, but it's such a hard, you ask those questions and it's so hard for Heidi to even, she doesn't have a cloudy ball, never mind a crystal ball on what's going to happen with that stuff. But I will say that the zoo leadership has always had the animals' needs first and foremost, and the visitors' desires, the guest experience is not far behind that.
Great, thank you. If you want to just kind of give a closing summary of why you think voters should support this bond, you're welcome to do so.
Sure, I'd just like to thank you for the time and opportunity to explain our thinking that went into referring this measure. We hear from community every day what a treasure the zoo is, and the opportunity to really look at this moment in time. One, our culture is really disconnected from space, from place and from nature, and it's a special place where people can gather, learn, and hopefully get motivated to take action for conservation in their own lives. Further, again, coming back to this moment we're in the tourism economy, we do see, you know, the travel folks, Travel Portland, downtown hotel owners, they're excited about the opportunity, even though it's not a downtown investment. Folks do come to downtown when they're coming from outside of this immediate region. So the ability to continue to be part of the tourism economy and really showcase Portland at its best for visitors and for those who are members and part of this region alike, I'm excited by. So I hope voters will vote yes for the zoo.
Great, thank you very much. We appreciate all your time today.